Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and tonight on Forgotten Mysteries, I have for you Sinners Never Die by A.E. Martin. You can see at the top here, this is an Inner Sanctum mystery published by Simon & Schuster in 1943. So we're going way back. And I think I've mentioned this on the channel before, but I really liked Inner Sanctum as an imprint. Their editors were adventurous and maybe avant-garde isn't the word, but you could tell they liked books that were not everyday run-of-the-mill whodunits or country house murders. They have some really, really interesting stuff on their list. So if I'm browsing in a bookstore and I see books by authors I haven't heard of but are published by Inner Sanctum, I think, I will most likely pick it up if the price is reasonable because I really trust the editors of that imprint. So the thing about A.E. Martin is I haven't really been able to find a lot of information about him. He is, I think, truly forgotten today, and that's too bad because this is an interesting book, and he's an interesting writer. I've read other books by him, so because I can't really give you a lot of autobiographical information that I've researched, I'm just going to read the about the author information on the flap so that you at least know a little something about him, because it is revelatory in a way. It says, this is A.E. Martin's first length book, although he wrote and owned a weekly newspaper at 18. He was born in South Australia, but his interest in meeting and knowing all kinds of people has carried him as far afield as Invercargill, the town nearest to the South Pole, and mixed him up in all kinds of fascinating jobs. He has managed prize fighters, freaks, and great stars. He toured with Vaudeville. He bought up documentary films in Europe and exhibited them in Australia. When the war put an end to his young and flourishing travel agency, he returned back to his first love, writing. He is a sensitive and perceptive observer of wide and varied experience with a deep understanding of his fellow beings. Okay, so that's A.E. Martin, and I think what they say about him is true. So let me tell you a little bit about this book, and then we'll talk about some of the reasons why it's worth reading and why it's definitely not your average day at the office. So the plot, it's a first-person narrative told by Harry Ford. And Martin does something that is hard to do well, and that is make a first-person narrator unlikable. Harry Ford is not a likable guy. He's got issues. He is the postmaster in a small town in Australia that's never named in the 1890s, where we're given very, very scant information about the time setting, but we do know that it's pre-20th century. And he uses his position as the postmaster and the man through whom all of the mail of the town goes through to basically spy on and keep tabs on other people in town. We don't really know at the beginning if it's just because he's nosy or if he's looking for information that he might be able to use against somebody, maybe blackmail, find out things about people. And he likes the idea of having power, right? Of having power over people by knowing their secrets. I guess what we would call today a petty bureaucrat. I'm kind of put in mind of some people at town halls I've gone to in the area where I live, where the employees have been just rotten to the core because they have union jobs and lots of power, and they are going to exercise it. Whether it's telling you can't bring out your garbage pails before 6 p.m. or, do other little tiny bureaucratic things. But that's kind of what Harry Ford is like. And as the book opens, he is lying in a hospital bed. He's elderly, and he's looking back on his earlier life and how he got to where he is, which is kind of a lonely, cranky old man. So the way the way the plot gets moving is that a man in town is basically murdered while Harry watches. And Harry thinks, aha, here's my opportunity. He had made recently a very bad investment and lost his money. So he thought, I need my money back because I promised it as a dowry to the woman I love, who, by the way, doesn't love him in return. And so he decides blackmail is the way to get his money back. In the meantime, what you've got going on is the woman that he loves, Eileen, is completely in love with another man from the book, a guy by the name of Larry, who disappears during a major flood, partly because he's so depressed. Because here's what's happened. Harry Ford, the postmaster, has tampered with the mail. He's taken a love letter that Eileen wrote to her boyfriend saying, the man I am going to marry is you. And because Harry loves this woman and doesn't want to give her up, he erases the man, you, and he writes in his own name so that when his competitor for the love of this woman reads it, he's utterly despondent because he really loves her and thought they had an understanding. And so I think we can all agree that what Harry did here is pretty awful. And it's not even the most awful thing that he does in this book. And it put me in mind of the fact that a family friend while I was growing up was actually a postman. And I remember him just sort of telling me about the rules of the mail in the United States and how mail tampering and mail fraud were absolutely like kind of heinous crimes that people, the government had zero tolerance for. They did not want anyone messing with the mail. So it looks like Australia was a little bit like that from the context I could get from the book. And I guess you realize we'd probably all be in deep doo-doo if our postmen were keeping tabs on what we got or steaming open our letters, reading them, and changing their contents. So as a result of changing the contents of this letter, Harry does get sort of promised to Eileen because her father is dying and wants to make sure that she has some money settled on her because he's penniless. And Eileen accepts his proposal of marriage because she's kind of thinking, well, am I ever going to do any better? And, now that my true love has left me, I might as well settle for someone who's going to treat me well and who has a decent job. It'll keep a roof over our heads and food in our mouth. So that's the plot. It's a story of an amoral postmaster blackmailing people, gossiping about them, trying to be a puppet master of the people in his town, none of whom quite trust him for obvious reasons, right? He's a nasty man. He grew up in, I guess, if it was the United States, we'd call it maybe an upper middle class household, and came to take on the airs of one, like almost of the bourgeoisie, that sort of very looking at everything in terms of class and looking down on people and the way they speak and their behavior and, almost as if he's the English aristocracy, which he is not, but he thinks that way. And interestingly, even though he loves Eileen, a lot of what he thinks about is when they're married, how he's going to have to correct her behavior and correct her enunciation and correct her dressing and her wardrobe and all these other little things about her that, don't put forth the image of class that he expects his wife to have. So there's the basics. And so as I mentioned at the start of this video, it's really hard to do an unpleasant narrator because you kind of want to be there with them, rooting for them. And so to do something other than that, I think the author has to be very, very skilled. And one thing that I learned from a friend of mine who's a screenwriter, taught me a lot about the art of fiction, is that if you're going to have a bad character or someone who's really quite compromised morally as your main character, the way to make him more likable or the way to make him seem not so bad is to have characters who are worse. And A.E. Martin does exactly that. The murder victim here is a man named Timothy Speak, and he is a nasty piece of work. Nasty, rude, abusive to his wife, verbally and physically, and just really hateful. He's also blind, and the author and the townspeople sort of assume that he has become so nasty as a result of being embittered by having become blind. But I can tell you, nowadays, in the current publishing atmosphere, we would never have a blind person or any sort of handicapped person be a villain. It just would not be allowed nowadays. But Timothy Speak is awful. And there's also another character in here who's kind of a holy roller type, Luke Barnby. Very, very intolerant and willing to say and do horrible things in the name of his religion, right? Sort of a zealot and very, very intolerant. And so that's a good villainous person too. I hate when religious people or people who have faith are made into villains because, let's face it, there are many people with religious faith who are wonderful people. But the author doesn't imply here that all people who have religious faith are bad, but just this guy Luke Barnby and his ways. He's just a horrible man. So you think, well, Harry Ford may be bad, but at least he's not Timothy Speak or Luke Barnby. And what happens is, and like I wasn't really expecting this to happen, and this isn't a spoiler because it's more about kind of a character arc or reader response criticism. But I'm pretty sure this is what Martin had in mind, is that even though Harry gets his comeuppance, doesn't get what he wants, is not successful in any of his criminal endeavors because he's misread situations or misinterpreted evidence or thought he was much smarter than he really is because, of course, he thinks he's smarter than everybody in town. What happens to him is sort of heartbreaking. And by the end of the book, you actually feel sorry for this man. So it's sort of a Shakespearean tragedy in a way. I don't think that's, too ridiculous an analogy, because he really ends up where he is as a result of his own actions, but can't see that he is, he is the cause of all the things that happened to him. And if he had gone down a different path of being kind and moral, he could have ended up having a very happy life. But he just couldn't get past his emphasis on class and his desire for power and his willingness to snoop. I mean, and this is a small town anyway, right? So everybody's already in everybody's business. So that's a good part of the book. Really draws a small town, very, very well. Because we all know, many of us have been there. I mean, I hate gossipy, nosy neighbors. Fortunately, I live in a place where I don't have them. But I have lived in a neighborhood of gossipy, nosy neighbors, and that's not fun. So Martin he's a good writer. He You follow the story of Harry. It's kind of like reading a train wreck, right? Because you don't want good things for Harry because he's a bad person, but you're absorbed in his story, and you want to find out what happens. And I'll tell you something else interesting about this book. The first 100 pages are fine and good. I was enjoying the book. I wouldn't say it was a love affair with the book, but I was enjoying it. But then, around about page 100, Martin introduces an element that is really in his wheelhouse, which is the carnival milieu, which in the author biography and in other books that I've read, he knew carnies and vaudeville people and the entertainment circuit or whatever. And so what he brings in is a character, Mr. Boldoni, Marco Boldoni, who is an Italian mind reader who comes to town. And when he comes to town and starts doing his shows, the book really takes off because you've got that. I mean, I'm a sucker for this, that kind of psychic mind reading, ability to pick up on vibes, whatever. And the question always is, are these people who claim to be psychics real? Um, you know, I believe that there are real psychics out there. Not all of those who claim to be, but certainly some of them. And I just got really fascinated with that whole part of the plot and whether the mind reader is going to figure out or be able to tell that Harry has done all of these bad things and expose him. And in the meantime, the mind reader himself has secrets of his own that are very, very well plotted. And when the details of that come out at the end of the book, you think of Martin as being like, wow, he was really a good and subtle plotter because things that you didn't even think to question come out in the end and are explained. And so it's from there to the end, from like page 100 to the end, it's really very, very readable and suspenseful and kept my attention fully. And when I closed the book, I thought, what a shame. What a shame that this man has had to end up the way he did. You can't. It's like some of the old critics always said that an important part of being a novelist is being able to have pity, not in a condescending way, but to really have that understanding of characters and make you feel sorry for them or make you want them to have a happy ending, even though maybe they don't deserve it. And A.E. Martin was really good with that. So and the title of the book, Sinners Never Die, is interesting, right? Because Harry Ford is a sinner, and as the book starts, he's an old man, kind of hospitalized, and there's a Spanish saying that I learned from a friend of mine who's from Colombia, "Mala hierba nunca muere," which means bad weeds never die. And that's kind of the lesson here, that the good die young, as Billy Joel said, and sinners never die. Bad weeds never die. So if you run across a book by A.E. Martin, I think that you will find it something different from your typical whodunit. You'll find yourself immersed in a world that you may not know much about. Here, I would say, like, I didn't feel Australia exuding from the pages. I didn't feel like, a dingo was going to come and eat my baby at any moment. But what I did feel coming off the page really strongly was that understanding of traveling entertainment, traveling circuses, and that sort of that subculture, right? That was really quite powerful, until the modern era, with vaudeville and acts and taking your show on the road and all that other stuff. I can only imagine how exhausting that must be. Like musicians who have to tour all the time. I mean, as much as I love live music, and I have my favorite bands, I think, God, these people work hard for the money. As Donna Summer would say, right? We'll have lots of musical references today. Donna Summer, Billy Joel. Maybe I'll come up with one or two more. But that I don't want to overstay my welcome with this, but I did want to bring it to your attention because it's for those of you who like to expand your horizons and try something different. I think you would find this a worthy read, and because he's not really like a collector's item, there I don't really think there's a big market for his books. I think if you wanted to find a copy of this or one of his others, I think you should be able to do so for a pretty reasonable price. So, okay, that's all I've got for you tonight. The last video that I made was ultra long, so I vowed I would never do that again. So I'm going to cut myself off, even though I'm sure there are other things that I could say. And with that said, I wish everybody a great night, and I will see you next time.